Hi folks, good to see you again, and in this video I want to talk about setting the stage for dialogue. And I think that there's an interesting irony in preparing for dialogue, and that is, you might experience dialogue as this sort of organic and free-flowing experience, but ironically, I think it requires a lot of meticulous preparation. Sure, you might just be walking along the beach sometime and meet someone and stare into their eyes and have a dialogic moment. More likely, you might have coffee with your best friend and it's a very dialogic conversation. But when we have a group of folks that don't necessarily know each other very well, but want to talk about controversial issues, I think that requires planning with a lot of care about the choices. I'm thinking about one group of scholars. They wanted to have a group of strangers talk about abortion, and they did. They invited them for dinner, and they had a dialogue. But wow, did they plan with care. They spent 70 hours just on the letter that they sent to potential participants. And instantly, they made the choice. We're not going to refer to them as participants, but, quote, co-investigators. And, they're trying to communicate that what they're about is seeking shared understanding, not common ground. So instantly, they decided not to use that phrase either, common ground, but instead talked about shared interest. When it comes to preparing for dialogue in class, I think it's maybe like preparing for any class in that I would encourage a very detailed lesson plan coupled with the trust and freedom that you can absolutely deviate from that to follow the conversation where it needs to go. In terms of setting the stage for dialogue in class, I think there are three big parts. And this is really important because, what we're communicating to students is, okay, the conversation that we're going to have for the next 30 minutes or an hour is going to be different than all the discussions that we have on other days. And we're going to do that in three ways. The first is just by talking about dialogue. The second is by brainstorming some guidelines that we're going to agree to for this conversation, and finally by claiming the physical space. I'll talk about each of those, and along the way, I'm going to reference this handout that you should have a copy of. I call it the dialogue tool, because you'll find here everything you need to do what I'm talking about. Well, let's talk first about just introducing the concept of dialogue to students. And, this is not organic chemistry. I think that one way is this talks about four key characteristics of dialogue. I could simply explain that to students, and then we might have a parent share with a question like, when they have experienced a conversation that was dialogic, and talk about that and its qualities. Or I might say, when in your life have you felt the need for a more dialogic conversation? And we could talk about that in light of these qualities. Another great way to introduce dialogue is to do what I did in the last video, and that is contrast it with debate. And again, on your dialogue tool handout, you've got a list of characteristics of debate and characteristics of dialogue. What I sometimes do with groups here is say, okay, put a little plus sign by the two characteristics of dialogue that you think come pretty naturally to you. And then maybe put a check mark by those two characteristics of dialogue that are hard for you because you have a natural tendency to err on the side of debate. And then whether it's a whole group or small groups, we can have a conversation about that and get a good feel for what dialogue is all about. Well, once I have introduced dialogue, and the next step is that we need to brainstorm some guidelines for this conversation. And you can have students just kind of popcorn it out, and you can write it on the board or a flip chart. And, without too much trouble, they'll come up with things like no name calling and don't interrupt each other. And this is all a great start. Then, after brainstorming them, you can hand out a list, and there are lots of lists of these available. I can give you some more handouts, but here's a good one that you've got right here. And I would ask the group, is there anything on here that sounds good to you that you'd like to add? If they didn't come up with it, using I statements is really helpful. There's a big difference between I think, I feel, and what you need to understand is, incidentally, quick story. I'll never forget I statements because I was on an intercultural dialogue trip one time in Turkey, and there was this couple, this pastor couple, and it was after midnight. They'd had some wine, and they started having an argument and raised voices, and everybody else finally was staring at him. It got really awkward. Finally, she just got up in his face and screamed, "And could you use freaking I statements?" And she didn't say freaking, and yeah, I statements, really, really important. Some of the items on this list that folks tend to forget, that it's okay to pass. You don't have to answer every question. That we should have a presumption of confidentiality. I probably can't guarantee it, but it should be part of our covenant for conversation. Well, you might think this sounds like a sort of first day of class activity, but I would encourage you to do it every single time you have a dialogue. I do, even in my dialogue class. By the end of the semester, they can come up with a really complete list in a very short period of time. It's 2 to 5 minutes, but we've reinforced that these are the guidelines that make dialogue what it is. The final step might go without saying, but I don't think it does, so I'm going to go ahead and say it. And that is that we need to claim the space, which means putting the chairs in a damn circle. I was with a group one time, and I tested this and timed it. And you know how your classrooms all have those lovely chairs and tables that are on wheels? Yeah, most of mine don't. So I was with a group of about 30 people, and I timed it, and they got the chairs in a circle in 2 minutes. So it's worth the time because it makes a big difference. In most cases, I would recommend a circle of chairs without a table or desks in between them. And what's great about putting chairs in a circle is that it also signals that this time is different than other times, and we're having a different conversation. Side note, here's a pro tip. If you have to put the furniture back and you don't want to get stuck with that mess, then you're probably saving the last 5 minutes of class to sum up and talk about what's happening next time. When there's 7 minutes left in class, invite the students to put the classroom back together and return to rows, and then take the last few minutes to sum up and give your commercial for next time. Rooms all put back together. All 3 of these steps are important. Talk about dialogue, agree on the guidelines, claim the space. And what we're doing here, it's kind of like if you were on a retreat with campus ministry and you had a small group and maybe they were going to do some next level sharing, or they were going to pray together, you would, maybe light a candle, and that creates a sacred space? Well, you don't have to light a candle for dialogue, but we are definitely doing all this to create a space. William Isaacs calls it a caring container. We're creating the caring container for this conversation. And now that you're all, got your container ready to go and you're sitting in a circle and ready to start, in the next video, I'll talk about how we get that dialogue going.